By late November 1950, the war in Korea had taken a dramatic turn, and the mountains surrounding the Chosin Reservoir became the stage for one of the most harrowing battles ever fought by American forces, a campaign not defined by sweeping maneuvers or decisive breakthroughs, but by survival itself, as the U.S. Marines and attached Army units advanced northward into terrain so hostile it would soon rival the enemy as the greatest threat to life. Following the success of the Incheon landings and the rapid collapse of North Korean forces, United Nations commanders believed the war was nearing its end, and under orders to push toward the Yalu River before winter set in, Allied troops moved deeper into North Korea with a mixture of confidence and exhaustion, unaware that hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers were already slipping silently across the border, massing unseen in the mountains ahead. The Chosin Reservoir region was a vast, frozen wilderness of jagged peaks, narrow roads carved into cliffs, and deep valleys that funneled movement into single-lane mountain tracks, all of it lying at altitudes where temperatures plunged well below zero and winds cut through uniforms like knives. Yet commanders pressed forward, convinced resistance would be light and short-lived, dismissing warnings about enemy concentrations and underestimating the ferocity of the coming winter. The Marines of the 1st Marine Division, along with elements of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division, advanced along separate axes toward the reservoir, their columns stretched thin across miles of exposed road, supply lines vulnerable, positions isolated by terrain that allowed no lateral movement and little room to maneuver, every ridgeline dominating the valleys below, every frozen stream a barrier, every village a potential ambush site. As the temperature dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit and beyond, weapons froze, lubricants congealed, radios failed, and frostbite began claiming fingers and toes even before contact with the enemy intensified, while tents stiffened like boards, canteens froze solid, and wounded men risked death simply from exposure. Yet the advance continued, driven by orders, momentum, and the belief that speed would end the war before winter could take its full toll. Unknown to the advancing columns, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army had completed one of the most extraordinary troop movements in modern warfare, marching entire armies through mountain passes at night, hiding by day, carrying limited supplies, and relying on speed, surprise, and overwhelming numbers rather than firepower, positioning themselves along the high ground overlooking Marine positions. They waited patiently as UN forces advanced deeper into the trap, allowing outposts to pass, observing routes, identifying weak points, and preparing for a massive encirclement designed not to repel but to annihilate the enemy through shock, isolation, and relentless pressure. As Thanksgiving approached, scattered skirmishes and ambushes hinted at something larger, but command assessments still underestimated the scale of Chinese involvement, believing they faced only small elements rather than full divisions poised for attack. Then, in the last days of November, the illusion shattered. Chinese forces struck simultaneously across the entire front, erupting from the darkness with bugles sounding in the freezing night, waves of infantry surging down slopes and through gullies, attacking isolated Marine and Army positions at Yudam-ni, Hagaru-ri, and Hagaru-ri, cutting roads, overrunning outposts, and severing supply routes in hours. Units found themselves surrounded almost instantly, fighting at close range in temperatures so cold that the wounded froze where they fell, weapons jammed, and casualties mounted from exposure as much as from enemy fire. The Chinese attacks were relentless, probing by day, assaulting by night, pouring troops into gaps regardless of losses, while the Marines fought back from hastily prepared positions, defending perimeters with rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery dragged forward at enormous cost, knowing that retreat was impossible and reinforcement uncertain. As the scale of the disaster became clear, commanders realized that the advance to the Yalu had become a fight for survival. The Chosin was no longer a stepping stone to victory, but a frozen cauldron threatening to consume an entire division. Surrounded, outnumbered, and freezing, the Marines prepared to do what they had always done when cornered: fight their way out. But before the escape could begin, they would have to endure days of isolation, constant assault, and the merciless grip of winter, holding ground against overwhelming numbers while assembling the means to break free. The frozen mountains closed in, the roads disappeared beneath snow and blood, and the battle that would define the Marine Corps for generations had begun. The first full night of the Chinese offensive at Yudam-ni descended without warning and without mercy. As darkness swallowed the frozen valley and the temperature plunged even lower, turning breath into white clouds and blood into black ice, while thousands of Chinese soldiers closed in from every ridge and ravine, their movements silent until the moment they struck. Marine positions, hastily dug into frozen ground that had to be chipped apart with entrenching tools and rifle butts, were thinly spread across exposed hills and road junctions, each position isolated by terrain that allowed no easy reinforcements, no quick retreat, and no margin for error. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the sound of bugles echoed through the valleys, a chilling signal that the attack had begun, followed by waves of Chinese infantry pouring downhill through snow and darkness, moving with speed and discipline, ignoring casualties as they pressed forward to overwhelm positions by sheer mass. Marines opened fire with rifles and machine guns that barely functioned in the cold, bolts sluggish, lubricants frozen solid, barrels cracking from temperature stress, while mortars fired until their firing pins snapped, and artillery crews fought frostbite as fiercely as the enemy just to keep their guns operational. At Yudam-ni, Chinese forces cut the road south almost immediately, severing the only route connecting the Marines to Hagaru-ri and trapping regiments in place, their supply line gone in a matter of hours. Attacks came from every direction, probing weak points, slipping through gaps, overrunning listening posts, interrupting suddenly inside defensive perimeters where Chinese soldiers fought at point-blank range with grenades, submachine guns, bayonets, and clubs, forcing Marines into desperate hand-to-hand combat amid snowdrifts and shell craters. The wounded froze where they fell, unless dragged back immediately. Medics working under fire with numb fingers that could barely tie bandages or hold needles. Morphine syringes freezing solid before they could be used. Men fought on with frostbitten hands, cracked skin, and ice-coated helmets, firing until ammunition ran low and then fighting with rifle stocks and bayonets, knowing that surrender in the darkness meant death. The Chinese attacks did not come as a single wave, but as an unending sequence of assaults, one melting away under fire only for another to surge forward minutes later, their commanders feeding men into the fight regardless of losses, confident that pressure and numbers would eventually break the defense. Marines counterattacked repeatedly, throwing back infiltrators, retaking lost foxholes, sealing breaches with grenades and machine gun fire, their discipline holding even as exhaustion and cold threatened to overwhelm them. Artillery fire, called in at dangerously close ranges, shattered Chinese formations at the edge of Marine lines, exploding among attacking troops just yards away from friendly positions, showering defenders with fragments and ice while buying precious moments of survival. Throughout the night, command posts fought to maintain communication as radios failed and wire lines snapped, runners risking their lives to carry orders across open ground swept by fire, some never returning, others arriving frozen, wounded, but carrying messages that kept the defense coherent. The realization spread quickly through the ranks. This was not a temporary engagement or a limited counterattack. This was a full encirclement by an enemy willing to accept unimaginable losses to destroy them. By dawn, the snow around Yudam-ni was littered with bodies, Chinese dead piled in front of Marine positions where they had fallen under machine gun fire, Marines lying frozen in their foxholes where wounds or exposure had claimed them during the night. As the attacks finally slackened with the first gray light of morning, the Marines assessed their situation with grim clarity. They were surrounded, outnumbered, cut off from supplies, and facing an enemy that showed no sign of retreat. Ammunition was already running low, casualties were mounting, and the cold promised to kill as many men as the fighting itself if the situation did not change. Yet morale, battered but unbroken, held firm.
The Marines reorganized their lines, redistributed ammunition, treated the wounded as best they could, and prepared for what they knew would come again with the next nightfall. The mission was no longer to advance north or to hold ground indefinitely. It was to survive long enough to break out, to fight south through enemy lines and frozen mountains to reach the coast. The battle for Chosin had revealed its true nature. This was no longer a maneuver or ambition. It was a test of endurance against overwhelming odds, fought in darkness and ice, where every hour held meant another hour closer to escape. And as the sun rose weakly over Yudam-ni, illuminating a battlefield of frozen death, the Marines understood that the worst was still ahead.
While Marines at Yudam-ni fought through nights of annihilation, the frozen crossroads of Hagaru-ri became the fragile center upon which the survival of the entire force would depend. A barren bowl of ice and dirt where engineers, infantry, and support units labored under fire to create the one thing that could mean the difference between escape and destruction. An airfield carved out of frozen ground in the heart of enemy territory. Hagaru-ri sat astride the single road leading south to Koto-ri and Hungnam, and when Chinese forces closed in from the surrounding hills, it instantly became both a target and a lifeline, a place that had to be held at all costs. Chinese troops attacked repeatedly, probing the perimeter, launching night assaults through snow and darkness, while Marines dug foxholes into earth so frozen that picks and explosives were needed just to break the surface, the sound of hammering steel echoing across the valley, even as enemy mortar rounds fell among them. Construction of the airstrip began under constant threat. Engineers and Seabees working with numb hands, wearing layers stiff with ice, grading a runway by hand because machinery froze or broke down in the cold. Every shovel strike a battle against time and temperature. Frostbite claimed men daily, tools shattered, fuel gelled in containers, yet the work continued because everyone understood that without air evacuation and resupply, the wounded would die and the ammunition would run out long before a breakout could be attempted. Chinese artillery and mortar fire harassed the construction site, shells landing close enough to bury workers in snow and dirt. Yet crews returned again and again to clear debris and continue, protected by infantry who manned the perimeter through sleepless nights, firing into the dark whenever movement was detected on the surrounding ridges. As the airfield slowly took shape, transport aircraft began arriving under fire, skidding onto the rough strip with engines roaring, unloading ammunition, food, and fuel in minutes before taking off again with wounded men packed aboard, some so badly injured that survival depended on reaching hospital ships within hours. These flights became a lifeline not just for Hagaru-ri, but for the surrounded units to the north, dropping supplies by parachute into snow-covered drop zones that Marines fought to secure against Chinese infiltrators. Air support also played a crucial role, with Marine and Navy aircraft braving weather and terrain to strike Chinese concentrations, break up attacks, and support defensive positions, though the cold limited flight operations and forced pilots to navigate treacherous mountain winds and cloud cover. Meanwhile, command decisions crystallized around a grim reality. Holding positions at Yudam-ni and Hagaru-ri indefinitely was impossible. Ammunition and food would not last, and the Chinese showed no intention of disengaging. The only viable option was a coordinated breakout south along the single mountain road, fighting through enemy roadblocks, steep passes, and ambush points in temperatures that continued to drop, carrying the wounded, the dead, and what equipment could be salvaged. Planning this movement under fire was a monumental task, requiring synchronization across isolated units, coordination with air support, and the preparation of defensive positions at each key point along the route to prevent the column from being cut apart in detail. Chinese forces intensified their efforts to crush Hagaru-ri before such a breakout could occur, launching repeated assaults aimed at overrunning the airfield and cutting the hub in two. Marines repelled these attacks with artillery, mortars, machine guns, and close air support,
often fighting at dangerously close ranges to protect the runway, knowing that its loss would doom thousands of wounded and trapped troops. Casualties mounted on both sides, bodies freezing into the ground where they fell, the battlefield marked by craters filled with ice and blood. But Hagaru-ri held. By early December, the airfield was operational enough to support sustained evacuation and resupply, and orders were issued for the breakout. Units at Yudam-ni would fight their way south to Hagaru-ri, link up, and then move as a single force toward Koto-ri and the coast, a fighting retreat through enemy territory that would test every ounce of discipline, endurance, and courage the Marines possessed. As the first columns began to move under cover of darkness, carrying wounded on stretchers over frozen ground, the meaning of the battle shifted once more. This was no longer about holding terrain or advancing north. It was about extraction under fire, about refusing to be destroyed, about surviving against all odds. The frozen escape from Chosin had begun.
When the order to break out was finally given, it was not an order to retreat in the conventional sense, but a command to fight south through an enemy that surrounded them, over roads that barely existed, in temperatures that killed without warning, carrying the wounded, the dead, and the living alike through a gauntlet that would test the limits of human endurance. From Yudam-ni, Marine columns began moving toward Hagaru-ri under constant pressure, advancing in disciplined formations that turned every mile into a battle, infantry guarding the heights, while trucks, artillery, and wounded crept forward along a single frozen road carved into the mountainside. Chinese forces struck relentlessly, launching ambushes from ridgelines, pouring down slopes in human waves, firing from caves and tree lines, cutting the road ahead and behind in an effort to shatter the column into isolated fragments that could be destroyed piecemeal. Every bend in the road became a killing zone, every narrow defile an opportunity for annihilation, yet the Marines advanced methodically, stopping repeatedly to clear roadblocks with coordinated infantry assaults, supported by artillery fired at point-blank range and airstrikes called in within yards of friendly lines. Vehicles stalled and froze in place, engines seized by the cold, forcing men to abandon equipment that could not be repaired, while others dragged artillery pieces forward by hand to ensure fire support did not fall behind. The wounded were carried on stretchers that froze solid, corpsmen fighting to keep men alive whose blood crystallized in the cold, morphine freezing in its tubes, plasma turning to slush before it could be administered. Frostbite became as deadly as enemy fire, fingers snapped off when gloves were removed, exposed skin froze in minutes, and men fell asleep in the snow and never woke. Yet discipline held. Units rotated lead elements, rear guards fought off pursuers, and every lost position was counterattacked until the column could move again. At Hagaru-ri, the breakout columns converged under fire, swelling into a massive, vulnerable force that had to push south through Koto-ri, the final choke point before the coast. Chinese forces concentrated their efforts there, recognizing that if Koto-ri fell, the entire withdrawal would collapse. Night attacks intensified, with Chinese troops infiltrating close to the road, firing into convoys, throwing grenades among vehicles, and engaging in brutal hand-to-hand fighting amid burning trucks and frozen bodies. Marine artillery and air support pounded enemy positions relentlessly, napalm lighting the night sky, freezing wind carrying the smell of smoke and burned flesh across the mountains. The most desperate moment came when the Chinese destroyed the bridge at Funchalen Pass, cutting the only route south and threatening to trap the Marines permanently. Engineers and air crews responded with one of the most extraordinary feats of the campaign, parachuting prefabricated bridge sections into the pass under fire, Marines and engineers assembling the span in sub-zero temperatures, while Chinese forces attacked from surrounding heights. When the bridge finally stood, convoys crossed under fire, vehicles slipping on ice, men clinging to the sides, knowing that a single failure could block the route and doom thousands behind them. As the column pushed on, the Chinese attacks began to falter. Losses had been catastrophic, logistics non-existent, and exhaustion universal. The relentless cold that had crippled the Marines devastated the lightly equipped Chinese troops even more severely, and their assaults grew less coordinated, less sustained, allowing the column to maintain momentum. When the Marines finally descended toward Hungnam, the mountains loosened their grip and the road widened. The sense of survival replaced despair. They had not been destroyed. They had not surrendered. They had fought their way out. The breakout from Chosin was not a retreat, it was a march through death that preserved a fighting force under conditions designed to annihilate it. As the Marines reached the coast and evacuation began, they carried with them not only their wounded and their dead, but a legacy forged in ice, blood, and relentless resistance. The frozen escape was nearly complete. When the battered columns finally emerged from the mountains and descended toward Hungnam, the frozen ordeal of Chosin did not end in triumph or relief, but in a last, tense act of survival played out along an icy coastline under the threat of renewed attack, where tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians crowded into a shrinking perimeter as naval guns thundered offshore and the wind off the Yellow Sea cut through exhausted bodies that had already endured weeks of unimaginable cold. Hungnam became a sprawling evacuation zone almost overnight, a chaotic convergence of Marines, Army units, South Korean troops, wounded men wrapped in frozen blankets, and civilians fleeing the advancing Chinese forces, all funneling toward docks and beaches under the watchful guns of the U.S. Navy. Engineers demolished port facilities as soon as ships were loaded, blowing up warehouses and fuel dumps to deny them to the enemy, while naval artillery and airstrikes held back Chinese probes pressing toward the perimeter. The evacuation itself was a logistical miracle carried out under constant pressure. Transport ships docked and departed around the clock, loading troops, vehicles, artillery, and the wounded, while landing craft shuttled men from beaches slick with ice, sailors hauling frostbitten Marines aboard as medics worked frantically to keep them alive. Despite the scale of the operation, discipline never collapsed. Units embarked in order, maintaining command structure to the end, carrying out rearguard actions to protect the final withdrawals. The wounded were prioritized, many so badly frostbitten or injured that survival depended on reaching hospital ships within hours, their faces gray with pain and exposure as they were lifted aboard. Civilians, tens of thousands of them, crowded the docks in desperation, and in one of the most remarkable humanitarian acts of the war, Allied commanders ordered them taken aboard as well. Ships overloaded far beyond capacity, carrying refugees south alongside combat troops. By the time the final demolitions were set and the last Marines boarded, over 100,000 soldiers and civilians had been evacuated from Hungnam, a withdrawal so complete that when Chinese forces finally entered the port, they found nothing but ruins and empty shoreline. The cost of Chosin was staggering. Thousands of Marines and soldiers were killed or wounded, and frostbite casualties numbered in the tens of thousands, many men losing fingers, toes, or limbs to the cold. Yet the Chinese losses were far greater, entire divisions shattered in repeated assaults against disciplined defenses, their lightly equipped troops devastated by exposure and firepower alike. Strategically, the campaign forced the United Nations Command to abandon northern North Korea, but it preserved the core of its fighting strength, denying the enemy the decisive victory they sought. What could have been a catastrophic annihilation became instead a fighting withdrawal that saved an army and reshaped the war. More than any map movement or casualty count, the legacy of Chosin lay in what it revealed about endurance under impossible conditions. The Marines did not break. Surrounded, outnumbered, freezing, and cut off, they held together, adapted, and fought their way out, carrying their wounded, their dead, and their honor with them. The phrase that emerged from the frozen mountains captured the essence of the campaign. We're not retreating, we're just advancing in another direction. It was not bravado, it was survival defined by discipline and refusal to collapse. Chosin became etched into Marine Corps identity as a benchmark of resilience, a reminder that victory is not always measured by ground taken, but by forces preserved against annihilation. When the last ships pulled away from Hungnam and the coastline faded into the gray winter horizon, the frozen escape was complete. The mountains of Chosin receded behind them, but the memory of that march through ice and fire would endure far longer than the war itself, standing as one of the most harrowing tests ever faced by modern soldiers, and one of the clearest examples of how resolve, organization, and leadership can prevail even when the world itself seems determined to kill you.